The hum of engines filled the air as passengers settled into their seats on the early morning flight. The cabin buzzed with the usual pre-flight activity. Flight attendants assisting passengers with luggage, seatbelt signs flickering, and muffled conversations blending into a quiet hum. Among the passengers was an older man, dressed simply in a well-worn blazer and carrying a modest leather briefcase. His demeanor was calm, almost unnoticeable in the flurry of activity. Warren Buffett walked down the aisle, his expression relaxed as he found his seat in the business class section. He nodded politely to a fellow passenger, who offered a friendly smile, then sat down, quietly organizing his belongings. Despite his global reputation, his unassuming presence meant no one seemed to recognize him. To everyone else, he was just another passenger. In the cockpit, Captain Mark Henderson was reviewing flight plans. Mark was a man who carried himself with confidence, sometimes bordering on arrogance. Known for his strict demeanor, he had built a reputation for being highly skilled, but also quick to judge others. Today was no exception. As the co-pilot gave a status update, Mark glanced out toward the cabin through the open cockpit door, observing the passengers boarding. His eyes briefly landed on Warren, and he frowned slightly, noting the man's modest clothing and understated presence. Without a second thought, he turned back to his instruments, muttering under his breath. These types always end up causing trouble. The flight attendants, oblivious to the captain's remark, continued their rounds, offering warm smiles and assistance to the passengers. One of them, a young woman named Clara, approached Warren with a tray of welcome drinks. "Would you like some water or juice, sir?" she asked kindly. "Just water, please," Warren replied, his tone polite. He took the glass with a nod of thanks, then leaned back in his seat, his focus shifting to the window. As the boarding process concluded, Captain Mark exited the cockpit briefly to address a minor issue with a passenger in economy class. As he made his way down the aisle, his gaze landed on Warren again. This time, his frown deepened. Something about the man's quiet demeanor and lack of apparent wealth seemed to irritate him, though he couldn't explain why. In Mark's mind, business class was for people who looked the part, and Warren didn't fit the image. He approached Warren's seat, his tone curt. "Excuse me, sir. Is this your assigned seat?" he asked, his voice loud enough to draw the attention of nearby passengers. Warren looked up, slightly surprised by the question. "Yes, it is," he said calmly, reaching into his pocket to retrieve his boarding pass. Mark barely glanced at the pass before shaking his head. "Next time, make sure you're clear about where you belong," he said sharply, his tone dismissive. "We run a professional flight here." A hush fell over the surrounding passengers. Some exchanged uneasy glances, while others watched with growing curiosity. Clara, the flight attendant, approached quickly, sensing the tension. "Captain, is everything all right?" she asked, her voice steady but concerned. Mark waved her off. "It's fine," he said, turning on his heel and heading back toward the cockpit. Warren sat quietly, his expression unreadable. He adjusted his seatbelt and resumed looking out the window, as if nothing had happened. But the moment lingered in the air, leaving the passengers wondering why the captain had singled him out. Little did they know, this quiet man's identity and his eventual response would leave everyone on the flight stunned. As the plane taxied toward the runway, the tension from the earlier exchange still lingered in the cabin. Passengers whispered among themselves, some throwing curious glances toward Warren. Clara, the flight attendant, couldn't shake the uneasy feeling the incident had left. She decided to check on him. "Sir," she said softly, leaning toward Warren, "I hope everything is all right. If there's anything I can do, please let me know." Warren turned to her with a faint smile, his calm demeanor unchanged. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady. "I'm perfectly fine. Don't worry about it." Clara hesitated, wanting to say more, but unsure of what. Something about the way Warren handled himself, calm yet composed, even under scrutiny, struck her. She nodded and moved on, but her curiosity about the man grew. Up in the cockpit, Mark settled back into his seat, his earlier irritation lingering. He grumbled under his breath, his co-pilot giving him a questioning look. "What's the deal with that guy in business class?" Mark muttered. "Doesn't look like he belongs there." The co-pilot raised an eyebrow. "Mark, come on. He's a paying passenger. What's the issue?" Mark scoffed, shaking his head. "These types always think they can act like they're on the same level as the real deal," he said dismissively. "It's about maintaining standards." The co-pilot frowned, but said nothing, focusing instead on the pre-flight checklist. Mark's words hung heavy in the small space, exposing an arrogance that had clearly seeped into his role over the years. Back in the cabin, the plane had taken off, and the passengers were settling into the flight. Warren remained in his seat, quietly reading a newspaper he had brought along. The other passengers gradually resumed their conversations, though the earlier incident still lingered in their minds. An hour into the flight, the captain left the cockpit to stretch his legs. As he walked through the cabin, his gaze once again landed on Warren. For reasons even Mark couldn't fully articulate, the man's calm presence irked him. He paused near Warren's seat, his tone sharp. "Everything all right here?" he asked, though the question sounded more like an accusation. Warren looked up, his expression neutral. "Yes, everything's fine," he replied politely. Mark crossed his arms, his stance imposing. "You seem awfully relaxed for someone who's underdressed for this section." The words hung in the air like a bombshell. Passengers nearby turned to watch, their expressions ranging from shock to discomfort. Clara, who had been serving drinks a few rows away, hurried over, her face pale with embarrassment. "Captain, is there an issue?" she asked quickly, trying to diffuse the situation. Mark glanced at her briefly before returning his gaze to Warren. "No issue," he said curtly. "Just making sure the standards of this flight are being upheld." Clara opened her mouth to respond, but Warren spoke first. "I assure you, I'm quite comfortable here," he said evenly, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made Mark pause. "Perhaps you should focus on flying the plane." The comment, delivered without malice, sent a ripple of murmurs through the cabin. Mark's face reddened, and for a moment, he seemed unsure of how to respond. Without another word, he turned and walked briskly back to the cockpit, his posture stiff with frustration. Clara leaned toward Warren, her voice low. "I'm so sorry about that, sir," she said, her tone sincere. "I don't know what's gotten into him." Warren gave her a reassuring smile. "It's all right," he said. "People reveal a lot about themselves in moments like this." Clara nodded, her respect for Warren growing. She returned to her duties, but the incident left the passengers buzzing. Whispers spread through the cabin as people speculated about who the quiet man could be. Why hadn't he reacted more strongly? And why did he carry himself with such quiet confidence, even under such treatment? Little did anyone know, the truth about Warren Buffett's identity was about to come out, and it would leave everyone, including Mark, completely stunned. As the flight continued, the murmurs among the passengers only grew. Those seated close to Warren exchanged guesses about who he might be, while others speculated about the pilot's unprofessional behavior. Clara, the flight attendant, couldn't shake her curiosity. She felt compelled to know more about the man who had remained so composed under such scrutiny. About 30 minutes before the plane was set to land, Clara approached Warren's seat again. This time, she carried a fresh glass of water and a soft smile. "Sir," she said, leaning slightly, "I just wanted to thank you for how gracious you've been. Most people would have reacted very differently." Warren looked up from his newspaper, his calm demeanor unchanged. "It's nothing to thank me for," he said. "People often act out of their own insecurities. I've learned it's not worth taking personally." Clara nodded, his words lingering with her. She hesitated for a moment before asking, "Forgive me for asking, but you seem familiar. Have I seen you somewhere before?" Warren chuckled softly, folding his newspaper. "Possibly," he said, his eyes twinkling with a hint of mischief. "I do get around." Before Clara could press further, the co-pilot's voice came over the intercom, announcing the plane's descent into the destination city. The passengers began to stir, fastening their seatbelts and preparing for landing. Clara returned to her station, though her curiosity about Warren remained. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, Mark was visibly irritated. The earlier exchange with Warren replayed in his mind, and his frustration boiled over into muttered complaints about passengers who didn't know their place. His co-pilot, tired of the captain's attitude, decided he'd had enough. "Mark," the co-pilot said firmly, "do you even know who that man is?" Mark scoffed, dismissing the question. "What does it matter?" he snapped. "He's just some guy who thinks he's too important to fly economy." The co-pilot stared at him, disbelief written all over his face. "That guy," he said slowly, "is Warren Buffett. One of the richest men in the world. One of the richest men in the world, and probably the most humble person you'll ever meet." Mark froze, his hands gripping the controls tightly. "What?" he said, his voice barely audible. The co-pilot nodded, his tone firm. "Yeah. You just belittled a man who could probably buy this airline 10 times over without breaking a sweat." Mark's face turned pale as the weight of his actions hit him. He remained silent, his mind racing through the events of the flight. The realization that he had insulted someone so influential, and done so publicly, left him speechless. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, the mood in the cabin shifted. Word of Warren's identity had spread among the passengers, leaving many in awe. Clara, now aware of who he was, felt a mix of admiration and embarrassment. She approached him one last time as the passengers began to disembark. "Mr. Buffett," she said softly, her voice filled with respect. "I just wanted to say, it's been an honor having you on board." Warren smiled warmly, standing and picking up his briefcase. "Thank you, Clara," he said. "You've been wonderful. Keep treating people with kindness. It makes all the difference." As Warren stepped into the aisle, Mark emerged from the cockpit, his face a mix of shame and apprehension. He hesitated before speaking, his voice low. "Mr. Buffett," he said, his tone far less confident than before. I owe you an apology. I had no idea who you were." Warren paused, his gaze steady. "And if you had known," he said calmly, "would you have treated me differently?" Mark opened his mouth to respond, but stopped, realizing the weight of the question. Warren gave him a faint smile and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Respect isn't about who someone is. It's about who you are," he said. "Remember that." Without waiting for a response, Warren continued down the aisle and exited the plane. The passengers who remained watched in awe, the lesson hanging heavy in the air. Mark stood frozen, the reality of his behavior settling in as the cabin emptied around him. Outside, Warren walked away from the gate, blending seamlessly into the bustling airport crowd. He didn't need recognition or fanfare. His actions spoke louder than any title or fortune ever could. And for those who had witnessed the events of the flight, the story of Warren Buffett's quiet wisdom would remain unforgettable. As Warren stepped off the plane and into the terminal, the story of the flight was far from over. Inside the cockpit, Mark remained seated in stunned silence, the weight of Warren's words echoing in his mind. The co-pilot didn't say another word, giving Mark the space to process what had just happened. Meanwhile, Clara hurried after Warren, catching up to him near the baggage claim. "Mr. Buffett," she called out softly, unsure if he'd stop. When he turned, his calm eyes meeting hers, she felt a surge of both relief and nervousness. I wanted to thank you again. You could have made a scene, but instead, you turned this into something meaningful." Warren smiled faintly, his gaze steady. "Kindness isn't about making someone else look small," he said. "It's about giving them the chance to grow." Clara nodded, her admiration for him deepening. "I'll remember that," she said. "Thank you." Warren patted her shoulder lightly, then continued on his way, his steps unhurried. Clara watched him go, a mix of gratitude and awe lingering in her heart. Back on the plane, the passengers had nearly all disembarked, but the ripple effects of the incident were clear. A group of business travelers in first class discussed the situation in hushed tones, their expressions a mix of disbelief and respect. One of them, a middle-aged man in a suit, turned to Mark as he stepped into the aisle. "You've got a lot to think about, Captain," the man said, his tone calm but pointed. That wasn't just any passenger. Mark nodded stiffly, his jaw tight. He couldn't bring himself to respond. By the time Mark left the cockpit and stepped into the terminal, the bustling crowd around him felt overwhelming. He spotted Clara near the boarding gate, her expression reflective. She glanced up as he approached, and their eyes met. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, Mark broke the silence. "I owe you an apology, too," he said quietly, "for putting you in that position." Clara tilted her head slightly, her tone measured. "It wasn't me you insulted," she said, "but maybe it's not too late to make things right." Her words hit Mark harder than he expected. He nodded once, then turned and walked toward the airport lounge, where he'd heard Warren might be waiting. The thought of facing him again made Mark's stomach churn, but he knew it was Nen